Hello, everyone, and good evening. My name is Andrea Pirro, and I'm the director of the Visiting Artists Program at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. And I am delighted to welcome you to our first public program of the fall season, featuring renowned writer Samuel Delany in conversation with scholar Karen Wachter-Green. We are so thrilled to have Samuel join us from Philadelphia, and we are grateful for the time he is spending with us this evening to share his extraordinary work. I would like to extend my gratitude to Samuel and Kieran for sharing their expertise with us. For those of you that are joining us for the first time, SAIC's Visiting Artists Program hosts a series of public talks by internationally recognized artists, designers, and scholars to expand our thinking about contemporary art and culture. These programs serve as a critical resource for the SAIC community as well as our extended audience. In addition to public programs, our guests meet with SAIC students through various engagements, and we look forward to welcoming Samuel back tomorrow for a discussion with students. Tonight's program is presented on the occasion of the exhibition In Your Face, Barbara DeGenevieve, Artist and Educator, on view at SAIC's galleries September 13th through December 7th. This major retrospective honors Chicago artist and former SAIC professor Barbara DeGenevieve, who passed away in 2014. The exhibition explores DeGenevieve's artistic legacy as a provocateur, her unwavering dedication to teaching, and her profound influence on both peers and students. You can find more information about this retrospective at the link posted in the chat. Joining Samuel Delany in conversation is Karen Wachter-Green, Assistant Professor of Liberal Arts at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. She holds a PhD in English with a focus on 19th and 21st century African-American literature and gender and sexuality studies. Dr. Wachter-Green is the guest editor of 2 special issues of The Black Scholar and sits on the journal's active editorial board. Her writing is published widely, including in Social Text, African American Review, and Palimpsest. Her first monograph, Black Kenosis, The Erotic Undoing of African American Literature, is forthcoming from Fordham University Press. Karen and Samuel will have a conversation for about 45 minutes, and then Karen will moderate questions from attendees. To pose a question, please post it to the Q&A box below, and we'll try to get to as many questions as time allows. Instructions will also be shared by our staff via the chat window. So thank you again for joining us this evening. And now I would like to welcome Karen Wachter-Green to introduce Samuel Delany. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrea. And thank you everyone for being here tonight, but especially thank you, Chip. It is such a pleasure and an honor to be in conversation with you again. My brief introduction here draws directly from Julian Lucas's 2023 New Yorker profile of you. In the stellar neighborhood of American letters, there have been few minds as generous, transgressive, and polymathically brilliant as Samuel R. Delany's. Many know him as the country's first prominent Black author of science fiction, who transformed the field with richly textured cerebral novels like Babel 17 from 1966 and Dahlgren from 1975, earning prestigious honors along the way, including multiple Nebula and Hugo Awards and induction into the Science Fiction and Fantasy Hall of Fame. Major critics have recognized him as one of the most talented science fiction writers of his generation. And in 2013, he was awarded the Damon Knight Memorial Grand Master Award for Lifetime Achievement from the Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers Association. Others know the revolutionary chronicler of gay life, whose autobiography, The Motion of Light in Water from 1988, stands as an essential document of pre-Stonewall New York. He has freely discussed his own sexual history in books and speeches, from cruising to sexual assault. None of it is confessional in tone. Deeply skeptical of biography's emphasis on defining moments and all explaining inner truths, Delany has employed his own life as a lens on the variety of human experience. Still, others know Delany, the professor, the pornographer who describes queer lives deemed unreal or impossible, or the prolific essayist and critic whose purview extends from cyborg feminism to biblical philology. There are so many Delanys that it's difficult to take the full measure of his influence. Also known as Chip to his friends, Delany has published more than 40 books in half a century, reinventing multiple genres, both literary and paraliterary, throughout his career. Delany's commitment to imagining the world otherwise is awe-inspiring. He is a sci-fi child prodigy who never flamed out, a genre bestseller widely recognized as a great literary stylist, a dysgraphic college dropout who once headed the Department of Comparative Literature at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and an outspokenly promiscuous gay man who survived the AIDS crisis and has found love 3 times in committed non-monogamous relationships. A story like Delany's isn't supposed to be possible in our society, and that, nearly as much as the gift of his writing, is his glory. The poet John Keane claims that Delany, quote, has given any number of writers permission to explore the outer reaches of the human imagination. He is, Keane continues, a peerless stylist and a radical theorist whose ideas served as a bulwark in the reactionary 80s and 90s, and I argue, still to this day. Today, we will hear about some of the abiding conceptual preoccupations that this legendary, celebrated, and deeply influential writer has explored for decades across his work. Welcome, Chip. Thank you for your time and generosity in speaking with us today.
Very much, Karen. I hope I can live up to that wonderful and generous introduction. When I was thinking about where to start, and it occurred to me, I just found myself going back and thinking that when I was 13 years old, I was still going to choir rehearsal every Sunday. Every Sunday. I was a very well brought up young man, but also around 13 years old, you begin to think about other things as well. And one of the things, of course, as I had heard, was that 42nd Street was a particularly a place where you could go to find sex. I had no idea how one did it, but I do remember there was a place called Hubert's Museum. That I think there's a picture of it on the screen now with me, so what I did is I took off, and I instead of going to Sunday school, I just took off and went down to 42nd Street and came up. And I think it was probably a Sunday afternoon, and at that point, or maybe a Saturday afternoon, and so most things were actually closed. It wasn't that late at night, but there I was, and so I went. But Hubert's Museum was open. It was one of the few things on the strip that was, on 42nd Street that was open. So I went down, and there's the picture. I think is the entrance of the museum at that time, or maybe a few years before, and it was a flea circus. Literally a flea circus. There was there was a half man and half woman and a fat lady, and all sorts of things like this. And anyway, so I went down, and I was wondering what you did, and there was a railing in front of the exhibitions, and there was somebody sort of talking on a microphone, I believe, explaining what we were seeing. So I had my hand on the railing, and at one point I realized that there was a young man, a couple of years older than I. I don't think he was more than 16 or 17. Young black man was standing there, and his hand was right. Unknown caller. It was right against mine. Um, and I realized, and I thought, well, this is being done. This is somebody who wants to have some kind of. And at first I tried moving my hand just a little bit away to see what happened, and the hand moved over. And I thought, okay, I know what's going on now. But of course, I didn't know how you did any of this. And so I thought, well, I will, I'll just stay here, and maybe when it's over, I'll meet him upstairs and what have you. And so he indeed did go upstairs, and I sat there and I waited for the show to be over. And then I went upstairs myself, and I never saw him again. But I realized I had come to the right place. So that was my realizing that I was right. 42nd Street was the place to go. Probably 3 o'clock in the afternoon on Sunday was not the way to do it. I'm sure there were other ways to, and which eventually I learned. But I think it was sort of interesting, and I got it. It was confirmed to me. This is the place. Although I never, I didn't do anything.
Unknown caller.
I didn't do anything for a number of years. In fact, till after I was 18. But there were lots of childhood playing around with other people in the Dalton school, kids in the Dalton school, and also and eventually. When I was just shortly after my 18th birthday, I went down and sure enough, I was taken home by a very strange and rather sad Israeli gentleman who that was a very kind of a sad thing, because he was so afraid I was going to do something to him that he sort of it was not much fun. And so I never saw him again either. But eventually I began to, when I thought, and I think it's interesting that it was only after at one point, my mother, bless her soul, I used to go out and I'd stay out very late, and I would, and often she would, and she said, well, I have to wait up for you. And I said, well, would it be easier if I wasn't living here? And she surprised me very much. Said yes. And so, yeah, So he said, then I will. If I know you're living somewhere else, I won't worry about you. So I had a friend named Bob Arenberg who lived at a place called St. Mark's Arms, and he welcomed me to come in to share the room with him, and so I was there. And by that time, it was very funny. The first thing that happened, I did start an affair with a young man named Leon, who lived down the hall from Bob. And it did free me to actually do stuff. And very shortly, a young woman named Marilyn Hacker, whom I had met on the first day of school. We got married. She knew I was gay from the very well before. In fact, when we decided to do it, I said, "Now you don't know I'm gay," and her line was deathless. She said, "Of course I do. You've taken me cruising with you."
Yeah, exactly. I remember reading that in Motion of Light and Water.
Yes, and
yeah.
So, yeah. So, and eventually I found myself in a situation where I was having quite as much sex as I could possibly handle. But it did start fairly, I didn't have the kind of, the kind of early life that but I'm trying to think of the young man's name. Hold on, if I could look behind me. Oh, yes. Oh, Lord, what is it? An artist. but I can't think of his name now. Whom I've written at least one essay on, who did start on 42nd Street at about 14 years old. But
David Wojnarowicz, right?
David Wojnarowicz. Thank you. That's exactly who I meant. Yeah, and but I didn't. I started much later. My sexuality. I was very fortunate in that it did not lead me to get AIDS, because I was 99%, oral. And that apparently as far as we know at this point, we have the virus just doesn't get transmitted that way. And so even today, I am still HIV free. But I was just very lucky that my own personal habits were set up that way. You had some. You want to?
I do. This anecdote leads perfectly into the first question, but I wanted to say, I recall reading a version of this story that you just shared with us about learning to cruise at age 13 at the flea circus.
Yeah.
In that beautiful book that you put out with Frederick Weston, that Visual Aids put out, Duets,
Yes.
that beautiful conversation between you and the outsider artist, Frederick Weston.
Yes.
And I remember, because it was a conversation about you and Frederick sharing how important Times Square was to both of your developments, right? And I remember Frederick Weston saying to you, he just couldn't believe that you were that brave to skip Sunday school and choir practice and to go to 42nd Street as a 13-year-old,
I went as a 13-year-old, but as I said, nothing happened for several, really happened for
Still,
several.
he couldn't believe you were that brave. I remember reading that in the conversation. I mean, and this does lead in.
To me, it just seemed curious.
Right.
I wonder if it's, but the good thing is it did confirm I was on the right path.
Absolutely. And so this does lead into my first question for you.
Yes.
In your memoir, The Motion of Light and Water, you address the formal connections for you between your creative practice since at least the age of 10, between writing and sex. So I'm wondering if you can talk a bit more about how you think about the erotics of writing, or how you think about the literary discursive aspects of sex.
Okay, well, how I think, for me, I developed sexually very early. I believe I had my first orgasm at the age of 6, which is young for some people, and also one of the things that I was told that my voice was going to crack. I don't know whether you as your voice deepens or what have you, you go through this period. You're supposed to go through this period where you start, and I never did. My went very, very smoothly from a boy soprano to a boy tenor, and then finally to a male baritone, and there was never a crack in the entire thing. And I did a lot of. I indeed thought myself I might possibly become a singer and arranger, and there was a group called Heavenly Breakfast that for a while I arranged for and sang with and played the guitar with, and then and that didn't work out. The thing that caused it not to work out, excuse me, is that Con Edison changed its credit policy to all these small recording studios all around New York, and about 8 of them had to close because they Con Edison wasn't extending them any more credit, and so the place where we were going to go and make a demonstration record, when we got there were literally chains on the door,
Hmm.
of course. And so that was the end, and there was nothing we could do. And so at that point, I said, well, maybe I better give the writing up for a while and see what happens if I stick to try writing, or rather give the music up for a while and stick to writing. And I'm still doing, and up until fairly recently, I was able to do it. And then about a year ago, I found that I had that gets, that, and that, you know. So anyway, there you go. What other questions do you want to put? Did I, you said, how do I think about the erotics of writing?
Yeah,
in
yeah.
the, yeah.
Yeah, because you described.
The problem is I never thought about
Oh,
the erotics of writing. I did my two pornographic novels are early pornographic novels, Equinox and Hog, were written one right after the other.
mhm.
And Hogg itself also overlapped with the writing of Dahlgren.
Right.
And it was sort of, and by doing it at the same time, all the sexual energy went into of Hogg, or went into Hogg, and then Dahlgren was just a story in which there is some sex.
Certainly.
Yeah, although I did not very much.
Well, not compared to Hog.
No, exactly. Yes, exactly. Not compared to Hogg. And so, um, and Hogg is, sex is a big part of most people's life. It was a big part of my life. And one of the things is eventually what I discovered is that there were a number of places in the city where you could go. Movie theaters like the Metropole on 14th Street, and there was what was the name of this theater? It was the Variety Photo Plays, which was on 3rd Avenue, and the building was, I believe, the second oldest theater building in New York, and various, and in New York itself, there were just lots and lots of places to go. And I spent my time in all of them and made out fairly well. But again, nothing really began to happen, as I said, until after I was 18 and indeed married.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Do you think of your pornographic writing like Equinox, Hog, The Madman, Through the Valley of the Nest of Spiders? Do you think of these texts as transgressive?
No, I didn't. I thought them as, oh, I want to do this. I wasn't, Hog had to wait 20 some odd years until it got published. One of the people we submitted it to was Erotics, who published, who had the what was the name of his press? Olympia Press. And he published all sorts of really interesting books, starting, Lolita and all Marquis de Sade, and things like that. And he once said, at one point, he said, if you ever want to, when he was still alive, he said, if you ever want, you can use this. This is the only book that I have never published, only because the sex was so far out.
Right. I remember reading that. Yeah, he had published Lolita, Marquis de Sade, and he turned down Hog because the sex was too out there. So obviously,
which was his nice way of saying he thought it was well written, and
sure,
and all the others. But but the thing is, unfortunately, by the time it was published, Maurice was dead. And I think a lot of young writers, I think it's sort of forgotten who Maurice Erotics was. They, people who were interested sort of in the history of publishing and what have you. But that's a fairly small. That's not anything like a mass audience.
Right. But obviously, right, the fact that it took Hogg until the 1990s to be published, even though you finished it in 69.
Yes.
I mean, and this publisher who published all types of work that's out there sexually, obviously other people find some of your writing, and especially your pornographic writing, to be so transgressive as to not be able to see the light of day for decades. Why do you think that is?
Well, because I think we have an anti-sexual culture. I don't think the same thing would have happened in France. I don't think that, I don't think the same that if I had been doing in Dutch or in Amsterdam, I don't think the same thing would have been. But America itself, not America, but the United States has always had a remarkably what would you say has been a very prudish place. Its approach to sex has been prudish. At one point, we sold the rights, I remember, to Bantam Books, we just said, well, here are these, my entire, or sometime around, I don't remember what the year it was, but at one point after Hogg had been written, I remember, yes, all my work went to Bantam Book in one great big mass.
Oh, wow.
Which was there, and my agent Henry Morrison at the time said, well, we also have these two erotic, novels that Delany wrote, and so we'll throw those in. You can, And I remember when at one point, not Pat Labruto, but someone else, who was said, he said he looked at it and he said, we'll never publish this. And he said, in fact, he went so far as to say, I think it's a brilliant book, but we'll never publish this. We were thinking, one, it's because the emphasis is not on heterosexual sex.
Right.
Yeah, that was the main reason. And the fact that it's like Erotics said, it's too far out there.
It's too far out there. Yeah.
So that's kind of what happened, at least as far as that's concerned.
So our conversation.
Samuel, here is your reminder. Kills.
Pardon me.
Our conversation is presented, as Andrea said, on the occasion of this retrospective of the provocateur, artist, and educator Barbara DeGenevieve. And our conversation is also presented on the occasion of a symposium that we're having on Saturday all day about her work. And it's called In Your Face, a symposium on transgressive pleasure.
Yeah.
So I'm just truly dying to know, what do you think about transgression? How do you think about transgression? What value culturally do you think that transgression holds, if any?
Well, transgression is a great big, it's a great Greek with a Greek, with a Greek origin, trans, and and I don't think that's the way I've ever thought about sexual writing. I know that there are some things that are forbidden. I mean, I thought when and which you at least goes back, at least on the I know what the word transgression means, but I think it also goes back to a sense of what you're not supposed to do and what you can do, and the fact that so many cultural ways were provided so that gay men could hook up with other gay men. you know, mainly by sharing spaces and or by sharing spaces. Um, the you know Riverside Park after 9 o'clock at night, which would and for a while I lived very close to there, and I could just walk over there and have a good time. Or as I said, there were all sorts of movies. Some of them were 24 hours a day. Some of them were only, were only part of the day. But they supplied me very well with pretty much all the sex I could conceive of having, and I could conceive some pretty large numbers.
So, yeah. So does transgression require some type of public infrastructure? I mean, you talk about this and
Yeah, well, yes, I think it does. Um, um, the whole city benefited from the fact that there were so many places that, people would happy to come to New York. Gay men were happy to come to New York because there was always a place, within 10 minutes of where you were staying, where you could get some, where you could hook up with someone. And this happened. Now, eventually, I became a professor.
Right.
I confess I never put on my resume. I put the names of the books I wrote. And one of the things I found out, it seems to be the one, I found out that when people get your resume in college, they don't go around. The last thing they do is want to sit down and read all the books. One or two graduate students who are really interested may may pick up a book and read it. But often, and some of them have come to me and said, "How did you get this job?" And I said, "No, well, believe me, the other faculty members have not read the book. I can."
What book do you think they were reading where they asked you, "How did you get this job?"
Well, I like Hogg.
Yeah.
Hogg, as I said, Hogg was an early book. And Equinox was too. And then and they accrued their amount of writing about them. There's a man named what is his name? I don't know. He wrote an essay. You'll have to. It's called Delany's Dirt.
Oh, it's Ray Davis.
Ray Davis, yes. And I think
great essay.
That's a great essay. But it's, there's one of them.
Yeah. Hey, I've published on Hogg.
Yes,
I've taught Hogg too. Yeah.
Do at some point send me what you've done. I'd love to.
I will.
Yeah. But anyway, yeah.
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, that's just it. As I said, there was all this stuff, but the people, the mechanics of getting a job, what they're interested in is the number of things you publish,
right? Rather
than what the content is. And but I think that's actually a little sad. I mean, every once in a while, I had there was when I first got to Temple, there was a man named he was the head of the English department, and his name was Caserio. What was Caserio's first? Right? Robert Caserio. Yeah, Robert Caserio. And he actually read my books, but he himself was gay, and he was and so he knew what he was getting. But we also had a very difficult teacher that I remember. He and she did not get along together, and finally he said, "I can't take being in the same department with this woman, so I'm leaving." And so he left 2 years later. He was only my boss for 2 years, and I stayed there for the next 15. Yeah. And,
wow.
Joan, bless her soul, kind of drove him out. I've always had a fondness for crazy ladies. And Joan and I actually became fairly close, and did a lot of work for the department together. Often, starting at 5 o'clock in the morning and going on, and where we would type together till and get this get just the busy work that you had to do to change from an a master's to an MFA.
I know people who are your student at Temple. They have such glowing things to say about you as a professor.
Well, I did actually spend some time trying to help the department. And I'm glad I did. But but that's because Joan and I sat there, came in 5 o'clock in the morning for about 6 months straight every morning, and typed up this. Essentially, our model was a geography MA, and it was like mechanical. You went, so you took that, and every time you get to a noun or something or whatever, you'd put something that was relevant, and it worked. It actually worked, and we now have an MF. We have now have an MFA, and it was because Joan and I came to school, 2 hours early, 3 or 4 days a week, and because we also liked each other.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
So I want to return to this idea of New York as benefiting from the public sex cultures that you've been describing. 25 years since its publication, Times Square Red, Times Square Blue's still radical vision of the sexual and the social implores us to contact, to reawaken and to find one another openly and generously. I'm really curious to hear from you where contact exists today beyond the digital.
Okay. Beyond the digital.
Beyond the digital.
Okay. I don't know.
I know.
I'm too old.
Hey, I don't know.
No, I don't know. I don't know where it goes. Most of the places that were out there were there. I have gone and folded up, and I don't know. And because I am so much older, and now that I am I don't. Your body changes. I don't have the overwhelming need for sexual release as I used to have. Dennis and my current partner and we take care of that fairly well. And the point is, once I finished that book, Times Square Red, Times Square Blue, that was the end of it. It was not something I don't live in the same city. I haven't lived in the same city for many years. So I don't know what New York is like, because I ended up moving to Pennsylvania. And I tried to find out a little bit about Pennsylvania, about Philadelphia when I first got here. But even that, all the places there are now also closed up. And everything is now done with Grindr and Tinder and one other. There's a straight app, and I can't remember what it is. And more power to it. I hope they work great.
But what do you think happens to society, to culture, when these spaces, right, these brick and mortar spaces, that's infrastructure for public sex, shuts down and closes up? I mean,
I don't know. What happens is it moves the electronic. Some very bright person comes up with a new app. As I said, and we get our Grinders and Tinders, and there's one other I can't remember because I never used it.
I
And
teach
I only used Tinder. I only used not Grinder. Huh?
Scruff.
What?
Scruff.
I can. Scruff.
Scruff.
What is the opening letter?
S.
Oh, scruff.
Scruff.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Sure. Yeah. Scruff. Yes.
Yeah. I teach a class called Sex in Public
Oh, yeah.
at the school. It's my favorite class, and it's about how our sexualities are disciplined and made possible by public sex.
Yeah.
And we read your entire book of Times Square Red, Times Square Blue, and my students all inevitably want to know what you think of the digital, and how you think it compares to contact.
I'm very happy. I mean, have fun, but I've used Scruff once, and I had a very, very strange experience.
Hmm.
A very nice guy. And who apparently recognized me and was once bicycling along and saw my partner and recognized him from something and called out to him or something. And so, but the point is we never got together for a second time mainly because his bathroom was so strange. And I wasn't ready for it. And when I got, and it was just, it was a little bit more than I could take.
Oh my.
And I don't hold that against him, but I mean, so I never used the Scruff more than one. I only used one Scruff more than one. And I don't think I've ever used Grindr. I mean, I as soon as I'd go someplace and a bunch of students would say, "Oh, well, you need this on your, on your phone," and put a new app on my phone. Thank you, and then never use it.
No, most of my students in Sex in Public, after reading your book, which most of them fall in love with, I mean, they find the apps anemic compared to what you describe in terms of interclass contact in the theaters, in the 42nd Street District. I want to return to this idea that it just fascinates me that you don't think of your writing as transgressive, because so many of us, myself included, have interpreted your work as transgressive. And when you and I last spoke in July, I shared with you that something I and others just cherish about you as a writer is the capaciousness of your literary imagination.
Thank you.
And I'm wondering if you think art should be uncompromising to the artist's vision, regardless of social pressures to conform or tone down or appease.
I never saw any reason to tone anything down. I wrote the book. I wrote the books I wanted to write.
Mm-hmm.
I think I have one probably very bad habit for a writer in a capitalist system, which is to say, I found out that the one thing that turns me off about, and it took me a while. It took me a decade to learn that this was the case, because my agent at the time, who is now dead, was arguing with me. He said, come on, you're grown up now. You can, to get me to lose interest in a work, all you have to do is say, and when you write it, I will pay you lots and lots of money. Immediately, my interest in the subject turns off. I just don't want to do it anymore. I had a 3-book contract with Bantam Books at one point for $50,000 a piece.
Wow.
And I want, and I could never finish it. And I kept on doing these little $10,000 books that instead, which I was much more interested in. Now I think they are much better, and I think most people think they are. But there was only one that I could get started on. I wrote one, sold it. They said, "Good, do 2 more. We'll give you $50,000 each." And I never did any of them. I just don't. I think basically I don't think capitalism is all that good a thing.
Mhm.
It's really at the certain point. I don't think, you know, waving money in my face doesn't turn on my juices. There's some people it does. There's some people who don't. But I just never, I was not one of them. In fact, waving money in my face usually kills my and because there were these other things that were supposed the things that I ended up writing, they called fantasy.
Mhm.
The Navarian series.
You don't think of the Navarian series as fantasy?
Yes, I do. Yeah, but it's not. It is fantasy.
Mhm.
But the point is, but those were not the $50,000 books. Those
Mhm.
were books that they kept on waiting for. Those were fantasies, which they said, okay, yeah, we'll publish that, but we'll only give you 10,000 rather than the 50. You know, because it's fantasy, and you're writing, and we want you to write science fiction.
Oh, right. Mhm. Mhm. God, that series is some of the most beautiful writing you've ever done. It's just stunning. Something I have one more question,
Sure.
and then I'll turn it to audience questions because we're getting a fair amount of questions from our audience. When we talked in the summer, you shared with me that one of your most cherished items in your personal archives is your epistolary correspondence with Joanna Russ,
Yes,
speaking
which
of
is
science fiction. And you shared with me something that I found so exciting, and I told others, and they're excited. There's going to be a book, a collected edition of your letters.
as far as I know, um, Bill, why have I lost the name of the woman who was out? Huh? Joan Pollock? Pollock. Alex Pollock. Alex Pollock and Joan Lubin. Yeah, Joan Lubin. They are two graduate students who have taken it on themselves to do 3 volumes of the Russ Delany correspondence. Where the heck is?
Because that lives in the your Yale archives, right? Those correspondence.
Yeah. Alex has already done this particular book. Yes, this particular book, which is no on strike against God. Can you read that?
I can see that. Yeah.
Yeah, on strike against God, which is a wonderful book. It's a non-science fiction novel that Joanna wrote back in. Oh Lord, she wrote it in. Well, she wrote it. It didn't come. It wasn't published until. Oh, I don't know. I don't know when. I don't know the date that it actually came out, but it did. It took a couple of years. It took a few years for it to come out, and I haven't. And basically, I have Alec Pollock, Pollock. Um, um, did this interview with me, which serves as a part of an. I guess it's a. I think is it. I don't know whether I don't remember whether this is an.
So how long were you and Joanna Russ writing letters to one another? And were they handwritten letters? Were they?
Many of Joanna's were handwritten. Almost all of mine were typed.
Were typed.
Yeah.
And how many
many of Joanna's were also typed.
How many years was this correspondence going on between you two?
It started. Oh, I wish I. Well, it ended in 2011 when Joanna died. When Joanna died, and it started. Oh, I just don't remember. I remember Terry
70s?
Carr. Huh?
The 1970s, maybe?
Yes, it probably was. It was probably the night. Yes, it was probably. She was teaching at Binghamton.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and she, you know, and that's when, and I remember the first time I met her, I was invited to a dinner that my then editor, Terry Carr, at Ace Books, was holding at his home, and I went out to Brooklyn, where he lived in Brooklyn Heights, and I met Joanna. And one of the things that impressed me most about the meeting is Joanna never said she was a writer.
Oh, wow.
You know, she just
Did you know who she was?
no. It was just your Terry is having this dinner, and he wants you to come. And I went, and and then about 3 weeks later, I got the galleys.
Oh my God.
Picnic on Paradise,
Mhm.
and was knocked out by it. I thought that was one of the best books I had read in many years, and that, and then so I, and then we started writing back and forth together, and and we and eventually the correspondence reached Victorian proportions.
I mean, 3 volumes of Delany Russ letters.
That's not going to be complete.
That's not all of it, I'm sure.
The 3 volumes of selected letters.
Selected. Wow. What were some of the ideas that were forming the basis of your friendship?
Well, for one thing, by that time I had decided that, I had finally decided that homosexuality really wasn't a disease. Joanna wasn't sure.
Oh my gosh.
Sure.
Wow.
So I was always saying, no, Joe, why? Because there are too many gay men for this to be. If it's a disease, one, how is it passed? And 2, how is it passed? And 2, it seems to be a natural thing. I mean, the most recent thing I read something that there's a sort of some kind of thing that in any family with a lot of sons, with a lot of children, every 5th male is going to be gay. Someone came up with something like that 1 out of 5 of the males is going to be gay, and it's there because it's probably worked into the genetic thing that this happens, because for various reasons, because we don't want every guy to be just there to do nothing but reproduce. I have a wonderful daughter who is now today a doctor, and I love her dearly, and I really do think she's quite close to her dad, and she's now 50 years old, and here I am, 82, going on 83. But I'm not going to be having any more children. Or at least I'm not going to. I met some guy whose father was 92, a gay guy whose father was 92, some years ago. All sorts of things like that.
Wow, so you and Joanna Russ were writing back and forth about is being gay a disease?
Yes, yeah. Well, this is before she has a book, her second book, where she cures a character of gay, in a book called "And Chaos Died," which is not in her collected,
right.
Her not collected novel, but I think it's a brilliant book. I think it's a brilliant book, even though it's got the sciences. You don't cure people. Freud.
Right.
What Freud said, that's the hardest. That tends not to change.
It's called "When Chaos Died."
Yes.
Okay, actually, yeah, one of my questions for you, and then I promise I'll turn it to audience questions. What are some of the unread or underappreciated speculative novels from the 20th century that we're just not engaging with?
Well, I personally am, I don't know whether they are. I think more and more people are beginning to discover um Theodore Sturgeon's work.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, yes. And
I'll
I,
see you in October at the Sturgeon Symposium. I'll
oh,
be there.
are you going to be, you're going to be
I
there? Well,
will.
I will look forward to seeing you again.
Babe, I look forward to seeing you too.
That's going to be probably my last traveling. Uh,
Yeah. So yeah, Sturgeon, people are appreciating Sturgeon.
yeah.
Yeah.
And I've known Noel for many years.
Mm.
And I have, and I actually exchanged a few letters with Ted himself, and met him on several occasions.
Wow. Do you remember what those letters were about?
But they're like two.
Mm.
I mean, well, one was I I I am very dyslexic.
Mm-hmm.
And so my early novels had to be typed and retyped again and again and again. Um, and I just assumed that that's how you wrote. Sturgeon actually wrote almost all of his stories. He thought first, then he sat down and typed them out first draft.
No,
And didn't make any mistakes.
no way.
Yeah, and I said, sometimes if he decided to do something else with a story, later on, but that, there would be changes. But basically, and he said in one of the letters, Chip, he said, I will now stop bragging about the fact that I write them first draft.
Okay.
And he said, but for better or for worse, I do. They are all first draft stories, which I think is amazing.
Yeah, that is incredible.
That is amazing. He just didn't revise. He would have, if he decided that one novel was going to make it one short story was going to be part of a novel, then he might make changes.
Mm. That's so antithetical to the belief that I certainly believe in, that writing is revision. I mean, revision is writing.
Writing is writing. I tell people I'm a terrible writer, but I can revise the hell out of anything.
I'm going to open it up now. We have a fair amount of questions from the audience. So here's one. Musical instruments play an important element in some of your books. I would say in many of your
books. Because I did do a lot of musical, and there was, this is not so, a lot of guitarists used to call their guitars an axe.
Yeah.
This was everybody. I write about that, and everybody assumes that I invented it. No. This was just a standard thing. You break out your axe. Break out your guitar.
This person is wondering if you can speak a bit about electronic instruments, imaginative sonic technology in your science fiction, especially as tools for transmission and the projection of the invisible and the imperceptible.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I've always liked theremins and things like that, which I once had one. When I say once had one for like 40 minutes, it's somebody else, and I never got one on my own. I wish I had.
Yeah. Oh gosh, I've seen theremin players live. It's just incredible. Yeah, I'm thinking now of so many characters in your stories who are musicians or who play musical instruments. There's those amazing scenes in Trouble on Triton. There's, of course, your memoir, Heavenly Breakfast, which is all about the band that you were talking about.
The actual band, yeah.
Yeah. And so many more. Here's another question. What kind of queer futurity do you envision for the next generation?
Again, I have so little contact with with the next generation sexually, that I can't, there's no way, you know, and plus I mean, you know, um, that I don't know. I don't know. I have
What
no,
would you
nor do I have any way of knowing
what would you hope for them?
that they have a better time than we did.
Oh,
You know, and that they don't have, and that at the end of Times Square Blue, Red, Blue, it talks about what I would like, would like to see then. And I still think if some of these homes are, places where if we're more, where they were set up for the benefit of women and
mhm.
more or less in the control of women. I think that's
Yeah.
great. That would be great. I
You
really
do
do.
you do talk about that, and I think it's in Times Square Blue, the first
Yeah.
essay.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Second one. Yeah.
Yeah, you do talk about that. You say that none of these spaces you're describing that were predominantly frequented by men, none of these spaces should be beyond the imagination and the materialization for women.
Yeah. hmm
Yeah. So maybe you would hope to see more of that type of space for the next generation.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. If they're. I don't know. Okay. I mean, Scruff and Grinder basically are male oriented.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, does anybody? Is there anyone? Is there an app pushing anything bisexual? I don't know.
Hmm. Yeah, a lot of my students in Sex in Public, they really want to read more about Sex in Public for women, spaces,
Yeah.
by women for women. So you would hope that the next generation has a better time than you all did.
Yeah.
People have some questions about your creative process in writing science fiction and fantasy. Somebody would just love to hear if you can describe what is your creative process when writing sci-fi and fantasy.
Get us think of a story and sit down and write it. That's what you do, and if you get it, I think of many things to write, and one out of maybe you know I actually, and what allows me to pick one and not another, I just don't know. I simply don't know.
Do you still write in notebooks?
Yes, yes, hold on, yes, I do.
Mhm.
And this is a very small notebook.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So is that where you imagine all the
Yeah,
various
because
stories?
one of the reasons it's such a small note because I don't write too much anymore. I don't think of large projects. Um, I think I really think my fiction days are over. I just
Mm.
uh, I'm lucky if I can write a Facebook post, and I usually have some help with my assistant, who is sitting over here to the left of me.
Yeah, Bill.
See.
Hey, Bill.
Hi,
Hey, Bill. I can't wait for Kenneth James, right? He's the preeminent Delany scholar working today. I cannot wait for him to publish the second volume of your journals.
Neither can I. And people ask me what's in it. I haven't read those things until I get a chance to read them again.
Right.
I have no idea what's in them.
But so this is the second volume of your journals. It's called Autumnal City, and it's your 1970s notebooks, which is when you were writing Dahlgren and Navarian, and yeah.
Yeah,
I'm
one
sure
of the things I was telling Ken, it's not the variorum edition of my journals. It's not the complete journals.
Mm.
And Ken himself decided, and since he was editing it, he would focus on what was already published. He would focus on the things leading up to the things that that had been published. There are some unpublished stories still around. I think that it would be nice to go through, but he wasn't interested in those, so those are not, you know, so you have journals that tell what led up to what leads, some of the work that leads up to the things that have already appeared.
Hmm.
Yeah.
I know people are very excited for that second volume of your journal.
I'm kind of excited too. I like to read it, but
Yeah.
I don't remember it. You just don't remember everything you write. 20 years ago, if you were writing a lot.
Well, yes, especially when you're as prolific of a writer as you are. Another person has a question about science fiction writing. They're curious if you have thoughts about how science fiction writing has changed since the early years of the genre and how.
I'm asked all the question is, and the answer is, I can't tell you. I never read that much science fiction.
Really?
I have read the complete short stories of Theodore Sturgeon through maybe 7 times. It's the best stuff around. But a lot of the stuff doesn't, I have read lots and lots of Johanna Russ. I have 20 some stories under my desk here of stuff of hers that have never been published.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. But I don't, but that's, that's it.
Hmm.
And I never felt any need to be a completist and read everything. There was a time, people like Fred Pohl and what have you, they read everything that was published. And they could talk about it too. There wasn't that, but it just got to be too much.
I agree. There's far too much. Did you ever read much of Octavia Butler's work? I know she was did you ever read much of Octavia Butler's work?
Yes, I read a lot of it. She was a student of mine.
Yeah.
And I think her short stories are brilliant.
Oh, brilliant.
I think the short, but there are not that many of them.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I don't, and I have strange feelings about. I'm not her biggest fan as far as the novels are concerned.
I also love the short stories.
I liked her as a person. She was a wonderful, wonderful person. Smart and extremely smart, and a very a very talented, and fun to talk with.
Yeah, I can imagine. Somebody is really interested to hear you speak about your transition to the rural, especially through the Valley of the Nest of Spiders, or more recently, Big Joe, because the city was so essential to your erotic imagination. And then recently you've turned to the rural, and they just want to hear more about that.
Well, I grew up in New York. I grew up in New York City. We did have a summer house. And which was built by my father. It was tiny, four-room house, and we would have these wonderful Labor Day weekend celebrations in which lots and lots of people would come. And so I spent a lot of time in the country. And then I also went to summer camps. I went to a place called Camp Hillendale first, and then about the age of 9 or 10, I moved to Hillendale. Was kind of a nightmare. It had there was a nightmare side to it, and that was in Nassau. And then I went on to a place that was in the Woodstock area and Phoenicia, New York, called Camp Woodland. And the Camp Woodland was wonderful. It was, I think, if I am a human being today, it's for the time I spent Camp Woodland. I think it was a great time. Pete Seeger came and visited us all the time. Every summer, he would come up and spend anywhere from, about 2 weeks with us, and teach us and talk to us and play for us, and that was wonderful. And there were, and the campers were great. I mean, there was a wonderful young man named Bobby De Niro.
What?
Yes, who was a year or two younger than I am. And there was Bobby De Niro. Why? That's why I call him Bobby, because at camp, he was Bobby rather than Robert. And there was a guy who was who turned into a rather strange philosophy professor. And there was another guy named Richard Castellanets, who I thought Woodland was just wonderful. He couldn't quite see what there was about. Was the only thing that he did get the nickname Costi at Woodland because there were too many Richards. And so people, he told me, but only about a month ago, that he got the nickname Costi at Woodland because there were too many Richards. And so they started calling him Costi, a nickname which he still uses. That's where I got the nickname's Chip.
Right.
I got the nickname Chip at Woodland, and somebody that they would take finding out people's names, and the guy, and Evan Charney, who was my counselor, said, "And what's your name?" And I suddenly said, "I can tell these people anywhere." I hated the name Sam.
Right.
And so I said, "Everybody calls me Chip," lying through my teeth. No one had ever called me Chip before.
It came out of nowhere.
Yeah, and people started calling me Chip, and they have been calling me Chip ever since, and I'm very happy with that name as a nickname.
So the rural has always been a part of your life. I mean, so it's actually not a departure in your work. It's always been a part of your life.
Yeah, starting from about 10 or 11.
I'm going to ask one final question, and then we'll say goodnight to everyone. Somebody wants to know, and I too want to know this, do you have further advice for writers since publishing about writing?
I do have a book called About Writing, and that's where most of my thoughts have gone, into that book. Get a hold of it, read it, and if you want to follow the, and if it seems to be talking to you, follow the advice. It's for people. Again, I know very few people. Sturgeon is one of the few who could do it first draft. Basically, as I used to tell people, I'm a terrible writer, but I'm a great reviser.
Right.
And so so that's how that works.
I abide by some of your advice in that book. At least I think it's from you. You'll have to tell me if it's not, because I've always attributed it to you. I think you said, write as simply as you can for the smartest person in the room. Is that your?
That's a quote from, oh Lord, what the heck is it? What is the, can you get a copy? Can you get the copy of About Writing there? It's down, it's the third down, there, About Writing. Okay, let me see.
That is just
okay,
wisdom that I abide by, and I try to teach my students the same, and I've always attributed it to you, and so I'm glad to hear that that is in the book.
That comes from Blanche McCreary Boyd, and she said that in Boston, in 1998. And she said, write as simply as you can for the smartest person you can imagine.
So right, keep your ideas high level, but write them in a way that's accessible. That's at least how I interpret that.
Yes, and that is a quote from Blanche McCreary Boyd.
And is that
outright? As she said it outright, and she probably said it many other times too, in 1996 98.
And is that advice that you would give to your students?
Yes, I would give that to everybody. Yeah, and you can find all my advice in this book.
Indeed, it's a great book. Well, Chip, I'm going to end our night, and I just want to thank you again for being in conversation with me. It's been such an honor, such a privilege, such a joy.
And thank you for such wonderful questions. Yeah.
My pleasure, and thank you to our audience for their wonderful questions, and
Yes.
thank you for everyone who was able to join us tonight and to take some time tonight to be with us. We really appreciate you being here, and with that, I'm going to say good night to everybody.
And good night to you, Karen, and thank
Good
you,
night
and
to you,
thank
Chip.
everybody else who has, participated and made this all possible.
Absolutely. Thank you to the whole team.
Okay, all right.
Good night, everyone.